I'm Margaret with Civic Nebraska's Voting Rights Team, and today on the Long March Forward, we take a look at the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Prior to its ratification in 1788, the 13 states comprising the Continental Congress were held together by the Articles of Confederation. These remained in place until 10 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. Under the Articles, the federal government had very little power. Each state sought to further its own ambitions, and reaching consensus was difficult. In 1787, the Confederation Congress met to redraw the Articles. Instead, they scrapped them entirely and started over. But disagreements soon arose between states with large and small populations as to the number of representatives in Congress each state should receive. The Virginia plan, put forth by the Federalists, would consist of one Congress with the number of representatives determined by each state's population. New Jersey's proposed plan was championed by the Anti-Federalists and would give each state an equal number of representatives. Roger Sherman, the representative for Connecticut, proposed what would come to be known as the Great Compromise. His suggestion became a bicameral legislature that would incorporate both the New Jersey and Virginia plans. But even still, the states could not agree on how to determine each state's population. In 1787, slavery was still legal in roughly half of the states. The delegates from states where slavery was not legal did not want enslaved people counted towards elected representation. Southern states encouraged counting enslaved people towards their elected representation while simultaneously denying voting rights to those same people. Neither side advocated that voting rights extend to anyone other than white property-owning men. Eventually, representatives agreed to a compromise, which became Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. I'm going to read the article as how matters around race and slavery were a central component in the founding of our nation. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Section 9 of the same article next protected the international slave trade for 20 years from federal prohibition. On September 17, 1787, the Constitution began the ratification process. 9 states would be required to sign the Constitution for it to become law. The nation was evenly divided in support and opposition to the Constitution. Anti-Federalists remained steadfast in their opposition to a large, centralized federal government, so a Bill of Rights consisting of 12 amendments was added to address anti-Federalist concerns. Despite these additions, the road to ratification was not smooth, with each state holding its own convention. Pennsylvania was one of the first states to ratify the Constitution, but some anti-Federalist representatives were dragged from their boarding houses and locked in the State House to complete the process. On June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. It took effect on March 4, 1789. With me today is the Director of Voting Rights for Civic Nebraska, John Cartier. John, can you tell us, what does voting mean to you?
Voting means to me a never-ending struggle for equality and representation, as well as finally realizing the promises that were made in our founding documents so many years ago that said that all men are created equal and that they are imbued with certain unalienable rights by their Creator. And it's also important to take a look back in history and see that even at the founding of our country, not even all white males could vote in our democratic republic. It took until 1856 when, for the very first time, white male suffrage was secured across all the various states at that point in time. So we're looking at almost 100 years after the Constitution was finally signed into existence, to where we see property as a requirement for being able to vote striked from the books. Now, as we all know, it took even a longer time to secure suffrage for women, people of different ethnicities and colors, and then finally in the 1970s, where we saw the 26th Amendment come into place that allowed 18 years of age and older the ability to vote. So when we're really looking at voting in the United States, it's been about 50, 60 years out of our entire history that we see the demographics that we see today who are able to make important decisions in representation. And that has had such huge impacts throughout the decades and quite frankly has given us a lot of the problems we now face today. And voting for me is also personal. I am part of the millennial generation, and we had to go through one of the worst financial recessions in our entire country's history. This resulted in millions of people losing their homes, their jobs, and I was part of that statistic. I was living with my single mom at the time. She raised me all by herself, and we were living in a home, and unfortunately, the home was foreclosed on as a part of the debacle that was happening at that time. Now, I wasn't really aware of the processes and the institutions in place that allowed that to happen, as well as the characters who profited millions and billions of dollars off of it. But as I got older and I learned a little bit more, and then eventually I went into law school and got interested in politics, I learned that that particular instance was really a case of the foxes running the chicken coop. And I mean a complete environment of deregulation, no supervision, and greed running rampant, and that at the end of the day resulted in so much pain and suffering for people. And banks and businesses got bailed out, but individual families and people, they did not get bailed out. They were left out in the cold. So I honestly believe that voting is a means to change some of these issues that we see in our society today, because if people are not invested in actively voting people in positions of power who are going to make good decisions for us, then we're going to see people take advantage of the American society and people. And that is a recurring thing that happens over and over in history. So voting, quite frankly, is the only means that we have to protect ourselves and our families and the resources that we're able to accumulate for our prosperity. Voting is the only way we're going to realize the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. And to me, voting also brings up memories of our founding fathers who, quite frankly, were very smart people, but they did not envision a democracy in the future that was representative. Now, John Adams, one of our first presidents, he was a staunch abolitionist, so he was pretty progressive for his time. But even him did not believe in opening up the elective franchise for anyone else besides land-owning, 21 years, age of older white males. And in a letter he wrote to a friend in the 1700s, he stated very clearly, "Are we going to allow others to vote besides us?" He said, "It is so dangerous to open up such a source of controversy and altercation, as would be by attempting to change the qualification of voters. There will be no end of it. New claims will arise. Women and lads will demand a vote from 12 to 21 years of age of older, will not think that their rights well enough attended to. Every man who has not a dime will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state. And it tends to confound and destroy distinctions and surrender all ranks to one common level." And to me, this means that John Adams was right. There will be no end of it, and that is a good thing for democracy in our republic. We cannot survive in a society where only a few people get to make decisions for the rest of us. And I look forward every day to waking up and making sure that voting in Nebraska, as well as the country, is protected for all of us, and we continue to expand it to even greater demographics and to more people.
Thanks for joining us today, John.
Thank you, Margaret. It was a pleasure to be here.
One of the activities our volunteers provide is assisting with voter registration on campuses throughout the state to commemorate National Constitution Day on September 17th. If you would like to support Americans' constitutional right to vote, become a voting rights advocate by scanning the QR code on the screen or visit civicnebraska.org. You too can join the Long March Forward for Voting Rights.